I knew it was an important mission because I had a 1-star and a 2-star general briefing me on what they expected.
A totally irrational move, and a totally unexpected move.
I was completely taken aback.
Consternation, disbelief. The Air Force kept wanting to bomb.
It's going to be a blockade.
A blockade is an act of war.
We are preparing for the possible Third World War.
They were one step away from a nuclear war.
One step away.
One step away.
How close did we come to nuclear war?
We were close, quite close to nuclear war.
It is just 90 miles from the coastline of Cuba to the coastline of the United States. It would take only 3 minutes for a nuclear missile fired from Cuba to strike Miami, and only a few minutes more to strike elsewhere in the United States. Good evening, I'm Maria Shriver. 30 years ago tonight, President John F. Kennedy signed a proclamation that brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the edge of nuclear war. Just 8 days earlier, he had learned that the Soviets had secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba. He was stunned, and he knew he had to take action. It was the height of the Cold War. Nikita Khrushchev ruled in the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro was in power in Cuba and had formed a strong relationship with the Soviets. John Kennedy had been president less than 2 years, and he was still smarting from his biggest blunder in office, the Bay of Pigs, the 1961 invasion of Cuba by U.S.-backed Cuban exiles. Castro responded by allowing the Soviets to put ballistic missiles on his island. This is the real story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is the terrifying story of how the courage and the character of 2 men, John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, averted a catastrophic nuclear exchange only at the very last minute. We begin Sunday, October 14th, 1962, as Air Force Major Richard Heiser takes off in his U-2 spy plane on a routine photo mission over Cuba.
The mission was from Edwards to fly direct on a direct route south of across the coast of Texas, over the Gulf of Mexico, south of Cuba, turn due north, fly across the Isle of Pines, across the San Cristobal area, one pass, and straight into Orlando. They briefed me at the time that they did have SAM sites, and they had no idea whether they would fire or not. Just prior to crossing the Cuban coast, you've already had the cameras warmed up and ready to start taking pictures. I knew it was an important mission because I had a 1-star and a 2-star general briefing me on what they expected. Majors aren't used to being briefed prior to a mission by generals directly. One of them said, Heiser, when you get on the ground at Orlando, I'm going to be there to pick up your film, and he was there.
We worked all through the night, and the next morning went over the photographs. Shortly after noon, we found 2 areas that were very suspicious. At first, they thought they might be surface-to-air missile sites, but when they started measuring the materials, they were much larger. The SA-2 is about 34, 35 feet, and these objects were turning out to be 65 feet long. And so I started flipping through the book on the SS-4, and when I showed Jay Contrail the photograph of the missile as seen in the streets of Moscow, he said, that's it, that's it. It was a tense moment because we knew that this was going to involve the president, certainly.
I went to inform the president, and he was still finishing up breakfast in the newspapers in his bedroom, and I told him. He was really quite cool. He was shocked, and it was, there was a sense that, you know, this was an unexpected and a very difficult and a very unpleasant challenge from Nikita Khrushchev.
Both publicly and privately, in the most secret kinds of communications, Khrushchev had personally assured him that the Soviets were not up to anything special in Cuba.
I was wondering whether I should raise the matter with Khrushchev. I said, look, I think this is a very, very risky decision. And his reply was, he said, well, we aren't breaking any international law. We're doing what the Americans have been doing all along, placing nuclear missiles along our perimeter.
Khrushchev said we needed full secrecy, and that the Americans would just have to swallow the pill when we tell them everything is already in place.
At that moment, we were highly confident of the Soviet Union, and we trusted them. We trusted that they knew how to do things. But if what I had proposed had been done, that is to make public the agreement and act openly, then things would have been different.
We immediately started working on details like preparing troops, loading troops, amassing troops in ports, plans on camouflage and disinformation, which was very important. It was all done secretly. First, we loaded the anti-aircraft divisions, then the motorized regiments, and then the missile divisions. When we added it all up, it turned out we had some 45,000 troops there. We put 2,000 servicemen aboard a luxury liner and placed an article in a newspaper saying that for the first time, a beautiful ship with Soviet tourists on board was heading for Cuba. But if you look closely at those tourists, you would have seen that most of them had shaved heads.
I was the captain of the Alipayas. The ship had been loaded with tanks, missiles, and military equipment. One ship carried missiles. Another one just warheads. No one ship carried a missile ready to be launched. We passed American ships on our trip and talked to them about where they were going and so on. We even exchanged gifts. They asked what we were doing there, and we said, well, we're training. All this time, we were being escorted by submarines. They were right underneath us.
The launchers and the missiles themselves were unloaded only at night and were transported accompanied by the Cuban militia. So during the day, no missiles or launchers could be seen. If at night they couldn't reach their destinations, they'd stop at a certain place, camouflage them, and wait for the next night.
So we had a very tough job maintaining secrecy. When somebody saw something, when somebody knew something, we had to isolate them.
I was completely taken aback. I didn't believe it for a moment. I mean, I didn't believe that they would do that.
A totally irrational move, and a totally unexpected move.
Consternation, disbelief. I couldn't have been more surprised.
If it hadn't been for the factor that we'd been led into something by being double-crossed, by being something being done behind our back, the feeling might not have been as intense.
One of the first steps that was taken when the missiles were discovered was to get U.S. fighter aircraft into position so that they could attack Cuba if necessary. At the same time, the naval forces began to move closer to Cuba so that they could launch aerial attacks on Cuba from carriers.
I had a White House white phone in my bedroom, And this morning, it was Mrs. Kennedy on the phone, and I knew something really had to be up because she would never call me at that hour. And her voice was strangely nervous and tense. And she said, Tish, you better come on down right now. There's real trouble afoot. We must cancel all engagements. We must not tell anyone why we're doing it. The house just closed up like a great flower. There was total silence. All of a sudden, everything stopped.
The president called me to his office and told me that he was calling a meeting for that morning at 11:45 in the cabinet room, that he wanted me to attend that meeting along with a dozen other of his advisors. The president was cool, almost cold, and cold was his way of showing anger. Very crisp, very deliberate, very businesslike. He wanted to know what he had said on the record, and he wanted me to prepare for this meeting at which the alternative means of removing those missiles would be considered.
When the president came in, we all stood up and good morning, Mr. President. He was very serious.
It was disorderly on the first hours, as you can imagine. There were all kinds of hypotheses and suppositions about what this might imply, what the real significance of it was. There was a feeling that we had to do something decisive. Just what we were going to do was difference of opinion. That's where the split was.
One day, he came out to my office, the president, and he said, I want to put in a taping system. When he pushed a button on his desk and the light went on, I knew to turn it on.
From 8 missiles there, one of them is in what appears to be the position that they're launched in the horizontal.
What is their range? We told them their range. And we told them we believe these are SS-4s from every evidence we have. The range is roughly 1,000 kilometers, and well, how far does that reach? Well, that reaches Washington.
We then began a consideration of alternatives, and we began a speculation of Khrushchev's motives.
There must be some major reason for the Russians to set this up as must be that they're not satisfied with their ICBMs. But it makes the launching base for a short-range missile against the United States to supplement their rather effective ICBM system.
Right from the beginning, the Joint Chiefs believed that the only way to solve that problem was militarily, which was the use of military force before those missiles became operational.
Those who believed the military balance had been changed were inclined to favor a military action, an air attack, and they were honest enough to say that the air attack against the missile base in Cuba almost surely would have to be accompanied by a land and sea invasion. Those of us who believed the military balance had not been changed favored other action, a quarantine.
I could see this getting out of hand even among my own colleagues.
This very large and sudden and surreptitious movement of nuclear missiles to positions 90 miles from our shore where they were capable of reaching the United States, Latin America, some parts of Canada, was clearly a highly provocative act, and it meant potentially the first nuclear confrontation in world history.
That was the risk that was in the president's mind, and it was in the mind of some of the others of us when we were trying to decide between these two courses, quarantine or attack.
But of course, warning them, it seems to me, you warn everybody, and obviously you constantly announce that 4 days from now you're going to take them out. They may announce that in 3 days they're going to have warheads on them. If we come and attack, they're going to fire them, or what do we do? Then we don't take them out. We then announce what they do that, they're going to attack them with weapons.
The President himself said to all of us, I do not want anyone else in government outside this room to know that we know what the Soviets are up to.
After the Bay of Pigs, supplies of weapons from the Soviet Union continued. But in addition, tanks, planes, artillery, anti-aircraft weapons were also supplied. Nikita Khrushchev set as the goal the defense of Cuba from aggression by the U.S. because we were receiving information that the U.S., the Pentagon, on orders from President Kennedy, had started drafting a military operation against Cuba under the code name
Mangusta?
The Mongoose Project. Basically, the Kennedy administration's purpose was to weaken Castro sufficiently so he couldn't make more trouble.
We intercepted a shipload of sugar en route from Cuba to the Soviet Union.
The CIA folks had decided that it was a great idea to put some stuff into the cargo and spoil it. And what they put into it was kind of nauseating chemical of some sort that would make people vomit when they took the sugar. And this was, the notion is it would make the Russian folks think ill of the Cubans and cause tension between them. And the president thought this was not very great. The president said, I don't want to hear about it, I just want you to get rid of it.
Finally, we bought the shipment and sank it in the watery depths of the Atlantic Ocean.
One of the things that the United States wanted to do was to keep Castro nervous. And therefore, there were periodically conducted exercises in the Caribbean. The name of the exercise was Castro spelled backwards, which is Arsat. And it was done to make Castro understand that this exercise had him in mind as it was being conducted. And so they made landings on those islands, the Marines did, to show Castro that we had the power to invade if we wanted to.
We had been living in times of great danger. All of this took place after the Bay of Pigs invasion and in the midst of a very strong, dirty war against Cuba. Economic blockade, subversive activities, counter-revolutionary bands, constant pirate attacks against our country. The determining factor for the installation of the missiles was the belief that the U.S. was going to invade Cuba directly.
Bandas contrarrevolucionarias.
For the air attack and the land and sea invasion, we made massive preparations. We moved troops, we moved ships, and we moved aircraft, and we assembled in the southeastern part of the United States a tremendous fleet of invasion vessels, accompanying aircraft, and associated troops. An immense force.
I was aboard the USS Joseph P. Kennedy. We knew something was going on. The captain had been going ashore and coming back, and there was obviously some activity. Our orders were simply to go to sea, to rendezvous with a ship somewhere off of Long Island. And that was really all we knew. And I remember it being a classic sort of New England autumn afternoon. You know, sort of wondering what will be here when we come back.
On Wednesday, the president, in order to follow his policy of routine schedule, normal conduct, fulfilled a campaign obligation to speak in Connecticut.
And on the way, he stopped at St. Matthew's Church. And we used to joke about making 3 wishes. And I said, Mr. President, don't forget the 3 wishes. And he looked at me very serious and said, today I only have 1 wish. And off we went to Bridgeport, Waterbury, in Connecticut, campaigning for Abe Rivercoff, a great friend of his who was running for the United States Senate.
And that is the reason why I believe it's vitally important that this state send to Washington to serve with your distinguished Senator Tom Dodd, another great Democrat, Abe Rivercoff.
When he came back that evening, there was a crowd there to greet him. He waved, he shook hands, he was all smiles, he was genial, he made a few jokes about the campaign. He stepped into the car, said, let's go, and his demeanor immediately changed, became very sober.
I think Kennedy had made up his mind, but the Air Force kept wanting to bomb. He wanted a Pearl Harbor. But you see, as we went through the week, we would say to him, okay, how many bombs do you want? Who do you want to bomb? Okay. So they would say, all right, we'll have 100 sorties. But then they would say, well, supposing, and then they'd think again, and then they'd think, well, maybe one of them was hidden, so maybe we better take out that. Well, before they were through, they had a massive air attack planned that would have practically wiped Cuba off the face of the earth.
After 2 days, ExComm, as the Executive Committee of Advisors to the President was now known, still could not reach a consensus. Some, led by the military, were pressing hard for a bomb and invade response. Still others preferred the less irrevocable alternative, a blockade. Meanwhile, every effort was being made to keep this potentially explosive situation a secret.
We start working on the night of the 17th on into the 18th. All of a sudden, there's a shout. We got slash marks here. And slash marks are characteristics of the SS-5. This meant that all of the United States, except the extreme northwest, could be brought under fire.
A White House meeting between President Kennedy and Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko today might clear the way for a visit to this country by Soviet Premier Khrushchev. Khrushchev has been hinting that he would like to come.
We all agreed that he should not tip his hand, that it would be a great mistake to tell Gromyko that he'd discovered these missiles when he wasn't yet ready to say what he was going to do about it.
And the president was being foxy with him, and he read that statement that he had made about offensive weapons in Cuba in September. And he had the pictures under his desk, the blow-ups.
We had the photographs of the missiles there. Gromyko met with the president in the president's office and in effect said the missiles weren't there. Now that was the degree of deceit that they were carrying out.
Mr. Minister, can we speak to you very briefly?
Oh, you want from me the church statement?
Could you, sir?
So now we're in the pool that evening. The president said, you know, I could see the lies coming out of his mouth. He said, I had to control myself from taking the blow-ups of the missiles and saying, what do these look like? And I'm going, oh my God.
The president and I exchanged views on several important matters.
We suspected something was going on because too few people were available in answering telephone calls or would stop to say hello. But we weren't at all aware that a major crisis of huge dimensions was brewing.
We were going from the State Department over to report to the President in the White House.
It was at night, and we didn't want the press to see us going over there, which would suggest that there was a crisis. So we decided not to go to the White House, but to go to the Treasury, because somebody remembered that there was a passage from the Treasury through the air raid shelters under the White House where we could get into the Oval Office. So we all, nine of us got in my car and had McNamara sitting on my lap.
Sitting on each other's laps, all these dignitaries piled on top of each other. One of them remarking, if this car is in an accident, it'll be some newspaper story as to what we were all doing in one car, looking like the clown car in the circus. But the purpose of this was not to have a convoy of limousines converging on the White House and alerting the press that something was up.
We had meetings on what to do in case of evacuating the White House. Someplace down in Virginia, something, how we'd get there, what the methods of escape were. But we knew that everything had been carefully planned in case we had to evacuate the White House.
Roughly at noon, I was asked to draft both an airstrike speech that the president would make to the nation and to the Russians, and a blockade speech. Now we were no longer talking about theory, we were no longer talking about some airy policy, we were now talking about how the President of the United States could actually explain and justify this to the many audiences that he would be addressing.
It was business as usual.
He made a trip, a campaign trip, into Cleveland, Ohio, Springfield, Illinois, and Chicago.
The President of the United States executes the law, but the House and Senate write the law. I believe the Democratic Party is committed to progress, and I come here and ask you to support me. Thank you.
At 9 o'clock in the morning, the ex-com met. I gave them my suggested draft of a presidential speech. It was reviewed with some changes. It was approved, and immediately Bobby and I called the president and said, we're ready. Come back.
Bobby's telling him that he had to come back. It was necessary for him to come back to make a consensus. And he said, how do we figure this out? And he was eating breakfast, and he wrote on Sheraton Blackstone paper, he wrote upper respiratory infection 99.2. Dr. Berkeley advises I return to Washington. And he called Pierre to give this to the press.
Was the fact that the bulk of the activities were outdoors, and it was a feeling of Dr. Berkeley that it would be better for the president to cancel this schedule and return to Washington.
It's been suggested that national security affairs were possibly one of the reasons for the president returning. Is there any truth in this?
The president returned because of his cold and because of the advice of his doctor.
The administration, the government, the Kennedy White House was doing its best to kind of steer us off Cuba. And toward the end of the week, of course, the president himself became a clue. He claimed to have a cold and canceled a campaign trip.
Between 1:30 and 2:30, he took a look at the speech. We talked about the two basic choices that were then to be presented to him. There was a presentation of the blockade, now called quarantine alternative.
Now, there was certainly some interest in trying to persuade the president to take military action according to what the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended.
The president had made his decision favoring quarantine over airstrike, subject to his having a conversation with the head of the Tactical Air Command to make certain that the so-called surgical airstrike that everyone had thought would be the ideal solution was not really a viable alternative. He had that conversation on Sunday, October 21.
The way the president put it was he said, Cam, I called him by his first name, Cam Sweeney, said, Cam, if I give you the word to go, can you assure me that we can take out those ballistic missiles? And General Sweeney reflected on that for a few moments, I would say. And he'd say, well, I will say this to you, that we will, I can assure you that we'll take out all those missiles that we know about.
And Getty said, well, what do you think is likely to happen? What would be your estimate of the amount of casualties, military and civilian, that would occur if we went through with this airstrike plan? And everyone said, oh, I think 10 or 20,000 people would get killed. Well, of course, that just confirmed Kennedy in his view that airstrike was not the thing to do.
He went to St. Stephen's on Sunday morning on the 21st, and while he was there, he decided it's going to be a blockade. He came back in the office and he said, I'm going to ask for a blockade.
On the Sunday of that week, there was no question now that all signs pointed to, one, a major crisis was at work, two, the administration was developing some kind of an action plan. And we so told Scotty Reston, we said, now you're committed to call the president. And the conversation went something like this. Mr. President, we promised that we'd call you before we print anything. We're pretty sure we figured out that the problem is Cuba and that the Russians are putting some kind of offensive weaponry into Cuba, and that you're about to do something about it as you are pledged to do. Kennedy hesitated for a moment and then said something like, I am about to ask the networks for airtime Monday night, get all my ducks in a row. If you deny me surprise, I don't know what the Russians will do. We thereupon had to concoct a story that told a little less than we knew.
The flights were continuing. We see at San Julian Airfield crates that we had spotted going into Cuba of IL-28 bombers. They were being assembled. And the bomber, of course, was considered an offensive weapon. We had spotted at the Santa Clara Airfield MiG-21 crates, and they were being assembled in a rapid fashion. In addition, we're finding coastal cruise missile sites being built along Cuba's northern coast.
We already knew that American intelligence had revealed the missiles. Cuban and Soviet intelligence reported that they had the pictures. Therefore, construction on the missile sites was accelerated. The warhead locations were about 300 to 400 kilometers from the missile positions, and they were camouflaged and guarded.
I was chief engineer of an intermediate range missile R-12 division. By October 22nd, all 3 missile regiments in Cuba were placed on high alert. There were 42 missiles taken to Cuba. In each regiment, there were 2 divisions, and in each division, there were 3 launch pads.
We knew that each one of those 42 missiles on the island of Cuba had a power that was 20 to 30 times greater than the one bomb that devastated Hiroshima.
All 24 launch pads were in a high state of readiness, which meant that all the equipment had been taken to the launch sites, including the missile fuel.
For a week, the discovery of the missiles had been the best-kept secret in Washington. But now it was time for the president to decide: blockade or bomb and invade. American intelligence at the time placed Cuban troop strengths at fewer than 100,000, and the number of Soviet troops in Cuba at only 10,000. What the president did not know is that both estimates were dangerously low.
On Monday, October 22nd, we had a day filled with meetings. Meetings of the National Security Council, meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, meeting with the Cabinet.
We had to prepare a special package of briefing materials to be shown to the congressional leaders that were being rounded up all over the country.
I was called, as others were called, at 8 o'clock this morning. The White House advised us that there was a matter, quote, of high urgency, and the President very respectfully requested that we appear at the White House at 5 o'clock.
President Kennedy will address the nation tonight on radio and television on a subject of the highest national urgency.
Myself in a upgraded condition of readiness in my destroyer with John R. Pierce. I bade farewell to my wife and 2 children and suggested that she should prepare the automobile for departure from Norfolk in case things got rough. I mean, after all, there was always a possibility of nuclear warfare, which no one wanted to talk about.
I left Norfolk on the 15th. I had in the back of my mind the possibility
that after I had been on my way, I might be told to divert and go to Guantanamo and evacuate the dependents there, and perhaps leave some of the Marines there to reinforce. There was enough tension in the air, in my mind, a lot of people's minds, that the situation was very, very, very difficult and might turn into a critical situation, which might require evacuating dependents.
On Monday, when I went into the office, there was a lot of activity, and by 10 o'clock, Captain Ball came out of his office and told me to put my things away and go home and pack one small suitcase for each member of my family and to stand by for a possible evacuation. My husband came in and he said, you're being evacuated, and he says, take good care of the boys, and he says, take good care of yourself, and he said, I love you, and he left. I was like in a state of numbness. You do what you're told to do, and you tell yourself everything's going to be all right, and you just go.
On the 22nd, the President put the forces on this condition 3, and they increased their readiness. There were some 500 tactical fighter aircraft in Florida, prepared to conduct operations if they were required by the President. There were defense aircraft, of which slightly over 20 were in the air at the time of the President's speech, armed with nuclear weapons. Land-based missiles that the United States had, which the Titans and the Atlas and the Minuteman missiles, with their nuclear warheads, were informed that they should be prepared to attack within a period of minutes.
So on 22nd, Gremko was supposed to leave from Moscow for New York. I went from Washington to New York. In the morning, to have a lunch with him, and then I went to the airport and said goodbye to him. And then suddenly there was an officer came to me in airfield from Mr. Rusk, and he said, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Rusk would like to see you today, 6 o'clock. So I begin to suspect that something happened.
Dobrynin came back from Rusk to the embassy, very much disturbed by the situation. He said that he, like me, did not know anything before, and that as it looks now from the statement that we, the Soviet Union, have the missiles in Cuba. He did not have any reason to doubt what was said by the Secretary and by the President in his statement. So he said, we will have a big trouble in these coming days.
The President sent a personal letter to Chairman Khrushchev, and he said in part, dear Mr. Chairman, The one thing that has most concerned me has been the possibility that your government would not correctly understand the will and determination of the United States in any given situation. I must tell you that the United States is determined that this threat to the security of this hemisphere be removed.
When news came that Kennedy would be addressing the nation, Khrushchev decided to call a meeting of the Presidium of the Central Committee.
The instructions were to deliver the president's note, which covered the text of his speech, at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. But, of course, there was a problem in that 6 p.m. October the 22nd was 1 a.m. October the 23rd in Moscow. They had these rules that they did not accept any communications between 9 p.m. and 9 a.m. They didn't quite know what was coming, but they knew something was up. And the duty officer from the Deputy Foreign Minister's office was in the lobby waiting to receive it, and he said, I assume this is bad news for us. And I said, well, I don't know. You'll have to decide that for yourselves once you've read it.
And I read it over to the members of the Presidium who were gathered there. The first reaction was quite calm. I think the first thought was that, well, perhaps we'll be able to get the missiles operative in time.
We had relatively hard evidence from the high. They were pretty sure that these were missile sites, and they could see them developing. Some of the shots, you could see a pack of cigarettes in the person's shirt pocket, or you could see wristwatches on their arm. You couldn't tell the time. They said, can you really take pictures that are that clear, that good? And when we said, hell yes, we can.
And then came his meeting with congressional leaders. They met with him in the cabinet room at 5 o'clock.
When the congressional leaders came in, they had not received any previous information about the crisis. When Mr. Lundahl showed the photographs to the congressional leaders, he said a big hush fell over the crowd. When he finished, he said that it just exploded. Many of them feeling that they hadn't been told properly, and they began then to question the president.
When he finally came out, he was angry. His eyes were flashing. And he said, he said, they haven't had time to really think this through. He said, like many of us, they want the airstrike. They don't see that the blockade will accomplish anything. And then he said, with words I can't really use on national television, if they want this job, they can have it. It's no great joy to me.
We sailed that afternoon, and that evening President Kennedy made his speech. I was down in officers' country listening to it. And that was the first I knew, and most of us knew, what was going on and where we were headed.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. Second, I have directed the continued and increased close surveillance of Cuba and its military buildup. Third, it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Estoy bastante
We were quite close, quite near to nuclear war.
Bastante próximo. Porque que se...
I gave the alarm order, and hundreds of thousands of men were mobilized throughout the country. All the artillery and anti-aircraft weapons were being readied. All the country's tanks, all of our weapons. We then had two armies here, a Soviet army and a Cuban army.
We received an order to be in heightened readiness, and by 21:30 we were ready. At 22:30 we received an official order from Moscow about a possible attack. Get the troops ready. Be ready to strike back jointly with the Cubans.
We had Luna missiles, and they had nuclear warheads. They were intended for use against land forces or onshore invasion forces. They were intended to take out enemy landing troops, and it was not ruled out that they could have been used.
The authority to use the tactical nuclear weapons was in the hands of the Soviet command. The chief of the regiment of tactical nuclear missiles had authorization to use these tactical nuclear weapons in case of an invasion or combat.
What we didn't anticipate was that he would put the tactical nuclear warheads there and delegate to the commanders in Cuba the authority to use those. That never entered our minds.
By now, all the equipment had been brought to the launch sites. The fuel also. The warheads were still stored in hidden caves.
It is very clear we, the President Kennedy and I, vastly underestimated the danger of nuclear war.
The crisis was no longer a secret. The president had spoken. The next move was now up to the Soviets, and the next morning, Nikita Khrushchev dictated his first of a series of extraordinary letters he and President Kennedy would exchange. It was before the days of the hotline, so the letter made its way to the president while Washington slept.
After the president's speech, I had spent my night in the State Department, sleeping on my couch. And in the morning, Dean Rusk, who had gone home briefly during the night, came in and woke me up, and he said, "George, we have won a great victory. You and I are each alive."
We're watching the missile sites very, very carefully. We see the equipment arrive, and then we begin to see indications that the Soviets are exercising the missiles.
The Chief of Naval Operations wanted his ships on the quarantine barrier to go out and intercept Soviet ships that were coming in. The President felt it was extremely important that they wait on this perimeter line and let the Soviet ships approach if they wanted to approach. Let the decision be in their hands.
Instructions were given to prepare the text of a reply. It was in the form of a message by Khrushchev in reply to Kennedy, and it read, "I should say frankly that measures outlined in your statement represent a serious threat to peace and security of peoples. The United States has openly taken the path of aggressive actions both against Cuba and against the Soviet Union."
It was the first time where the Soviet intercontinental missiles was fueled and they prepared for the launching. And our Air Force was prepared to the beginning because we think that if something happened, it will be beginning of the exchange of the nuclear weapons.
Of October the 23rd, 6 F-8U Crusaders are flying at treetop level over the missile sites. The photography was just so refreshing to look at something at low altitude rather than the U-2 materials at 14 miles up.
I remember the phone rang and Washington said, okay, execute one. So I said, okay, Riley, Coughlin, and me, we go. We became airborne and we stayed right down on the water. We were flying at about 350 knots and at about 350 feet. And I look up and there at 11 o'clock is the Havana skyline. And I thought, there goes the neighborhood, you know, they're going to know we're coming. And then all of a sudden this stuff down there started to come out. I could see that there was something there, and I called over to my wingman. I said, okay, move out to the side so we get it all. All 12 cameras are clicking away as we went over. Start putting them on the launchers, and you go in and you can read the writing practically on the sides of the missiles. Then you know what you got.
We thought we were going to go to war and that we were going to invade Cuba. In our battalion, we had the capability for nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapon called the Davy Crockett. The commanders at that time were prepared to use nuclear weapons. We certainly had them. We were ready, trained to use them. And yes, I think that probably we would have responded with the use of nuclear weapons if the situation had called for it.
There were 2 points of relief during the days that followed the speech. The first was when we received word that the Organization of American States, all of the Latin American states, had unanimously endorsed a quarantine and were going to join in it.
9 o'clock in the morning, we drive over to the Pan American Union building, which is where the OAS meets. My position was, as a legal advisor, that it was not consistent with international law to act unilaterally, but it was consistent with international law to act with the authorization of the OAS. And then the Secretary got up, and it was a grave and serious speech.
This offensive military capability is of such a nature that it can reach into the far corners of our hemisphere with its destructive force. These new weapons arriving in Cuba are not only directed against the United States. Let there be no misunderstanding. There are other strategic targets in this hemisphere.
Like all diplomatic gatherings, everybody seems to want to say something. And this went on all day long until late in the afternoon. We finally took a vote.
I now ask the Council whether it approves the draft resolution. Those in favor, please so indicate. Against? The draft resolution has been approved by 19 affirmative votes.
I ran over with the resolution in my hot little hand to the White House. The president didn't sign the proclamation until after the OAS had acted. So Evelyn brought in the tray of pens, and Kennedy said, I think I'll keep this one myself. And he took one pen and he signed his whole name with one pen, and he dropped the ink down in his jacket pocket.
We used the word quarantine because it carried less military implications than the term blockade does. Actually, it was a blockade.
We believe there are about 25 Soviet ships moving toward Cuba. The U.S. ship, by every means available to it, will communicate with the Soviet or other vessel, requesting the vessel to stop. If the vessel does not stop, refuses to heed the instructions, force will be applied to assure that it does stop. The minimum amount of force for that purpose will be used.
The military looked upon it as what John Paul Jones and others have been doing for 200 years, a military action. And by God, if it was a military action, you should carry it out as it had always been carried out. And that meant that if that first ship came there and didn't stop, you should sink the damn thing.
Instructions were that if the ships did not stop, then the Navy first would fire a shot across the bow of the ship saying, look, we mean business, you better stop. And then if that didn't work, they were to destroy the rudder of the ship so that it could not continue its forward progress.
And that's the day in the pool looking at me, he said, you know, if it weren't for the children, it would be easier to say you could press that button. And I know I looked at him oddly because he quickly said, I'm not talking about John or Caroline. I'm talking about all of the children in America and all of the children all over the world who could suffer and die if I made the wrong decision.
We had reports that Soviet submarines were accompanying at least some of these supply vessels. All of this was cause for the greatest tension inside our ExCom meeting.
The face-to-face test of will in perhaps the gravest crisis of the atomic age could come soon in the waters of the Caribbean. If the Soviet vessels refuse to halt...
by force on the... By now, the military preparations on both sides had reached dangerously high levels. Soviet ships were bearing down on the blockade line. President Kennedy knew that to stop a ship by force on the high seas was an act of war, but to yield would leave only military options to get the missiles out.
Well, there was great debate about what to do when the first ship arrived at this imaginary line. We didn't want that ship sunk. We didn't want to start a war over that first ship. We weren't certain that Khrushchev had been able to tell the captain what to do when he got to the quarantine line. And he certainly wasn't about to stop when a U.S. Navy ship told him to stop unless Khrushchev said it stopped.
A message was handed into the room that the Soviet ships had stopped dead in the water, that there had apparently been a radio communication from Moscow to the ships to hold position and not proceed toward the quarantine.
He gave the order to some part of the ships to stop, but other go forward, and so he showed to everybody that we not accept the blockade.
No one felt that the crisis was over when the Soviet ships stopped. We knew that it was only a pause, and Dean Rusk made his oft-quoted statement, we've been eyeball to eyeball, and the other fellow just blinked.
This tough tone, which was taken in Khrushchev's first reply to Kennedy on the 23rd, continued the next day also, on the 24th. And there, Khrushchev stated, you, Mr. President, are not declaring quarantines, but advancing an ultimatum and threatening that unless we subordinate ourselves to your demands, you will use force. The actions of the USA with regard to Cuba are outright banditry.
The faction who were an airstrike didn't at all relent. Their feeling was, okay, we'll let this go for 2 or 3 days and we'll really see what happens, but sooner or later we're going to have to take those missiles out. While this was going on, the Strategic Air Command was also increasing its readiness, and on the 24th of October went to the highest state of alert that it had ever been in its history by having about let's say 55 to 65 aircraft on airborne alert over the United States with nuclear weapons aboard.
They were hydrogen weapons, about big round as a oil barrel and 3 times as long. I remember it being 7 megatons. Things became more tense, and we took our job maybe a little bit more seriously.
All the Polaris submarines that were ready were put to sea. At the same time, 8 aircraft carriers were moving into position off of Cuba so that they could conduct operations as required in the invasion of Cuba.
They said no more practice, and about that time, the klaxon went off. That one we thought was for real. I was running and thinking, I'll never have another carton of cigarettes. I had a child. I had a second child. They were gone. My wife was gone. Shreveport, Barksdale was gone. There was no fear because there was nothing left to have fear about. It turned out that the klaxon had gone off accidentally. Someone had made a mistake and punched it. It was just an accident that it went off. And of course, all we did was start our engines and then go back and have a cup of coffee like we'd done hundreds of times before.
The Soviet ships were continuing toward the quarantine, toward the blockade, and we feared the worst.
The concern was not war through deliberate decision, it was through war through muddle, misapprehension, things going wrong somewhere along the line. No one knew what the hell was going to happen. So in Kennedy's strategy, the UN was one of the things of further resort to which he would apply before he'd go to war.
All right, sir. Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no.
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room.
A great deal turned on the quality and the credibility of the photographs, but it must be said that when Stevenson displayed them in the course of his speech at the UN, it did have tremendous impact.
As of Thursday, October 25th, definite buildups in these offensive missile sites continues to be made.
Throughout this week, Khrushchev had people come into his office to talk to him. But nevertheless, I don't think there was anyone who voiced any definitely dissenting voice to the general line of policy.
The president wrote to Chairman Khrushchev as follows. I regret very much that you still do not appear to understand what it is that has moved us in this matter. This government received the most explicit assurances from your government that no offensive weapons are being sent to Cuba. And then I learned beyond doubt that all these public assurances were false.
We received orders to join the Pierce to stop this ship that was headed down toward Havana. I remember the executive officer that morning as we were getting dressed, and he made the comment saying, oh, this can either be the biggest day in our lives or we start the Third World War. You know, we knew this was a reasonably dramatic moment. The Commodore wanted dress blues, and he wanted weapons. And so the executive officer and myself tried to maneuver it around to well, let's be formally dressed, but let's make it dress white. And then the Commodore thought, we're going to be in dress whites, maybe we should have swords if it's going to be this formal. Well, the idea of climbing a Jacob's ladder with a sword presented all possibilities of utter loss of dignity.
Well, the men were in their dress whites, unarmed. I thought they looked like $1 million.
I wasn't keen to carry a weapon. You know, you got over there, which is going to be a shootout on the forecastle. And the destroyer had 5-inch .38s, and I'd much preferred for them to let go than me having to use a pistol and run around.
I had my forward 5-inch gun mount trained on the Marukla the whole time. I don't remember that I told them to load, but it would have only taken us a couple of seconds.
It was very much like you'd seen in the old World War II movies. I mean, there were people in their helmets and guns were spinning around and people were charging around. We were aboard around 2 hours. We felt fairly sure that what they said was what was there. There was toilet paper on it. There was basically paper products that were being carried, and in amongst that was toilet paper.
The Navy has received from the scene of the boarding the following report. No prohibited material in evidence. Marukla cleared to Havana via Providence Channel.
On Friday, October 26th, Alexander Foman, whom we knew to be the head of the KGB in Washington, called John Scally.
He was had the rank of full colonel, and he was known as a close friend of Nikita Khrushchev.
And so Foman said to Scally,
there might be a way out of this. He said,
we Soviets will pull the missiles out of Cuba under UN supervision if Kennedy will make a public announcement that the United States will not invade Cuba.
They decided that it was such an unusual development, and since it came from the head of KGB, that it probably was an official move.
That afternoon, looking at the photography, we could see that the Soviets were attempting to camouflage the missile sites. They were using plastic sheathing, they were using nets and garnishing, and this was a new dimension to the missile sites.
There is no evidence to date indicating that there is any intention to dismantle or discontinue work on these missile sites.
After the boarding of the Marukla, there were no additional contacts, but the blockade continued. What followed next was the saga of the 2 letters. The first was a somewhat conciliatory and promising note from Khrushchev, offering to withdraw the missiles in return for a U.S. guarantee never to invade Cuba. This was followed within hours by a second, far more demanding message. Some speculated that Khrushchev may have been overthrown during the night and that hardliners had taken control.
Finally, on the 26th, came 2 letters from Khrushchev to Kennedy.
Rusk and I were sitting in the Oval Office as the letter was coming in, and it was obviously a letter that had been written in great pain and agony by Khrushchev.
The USA itself would not participate in an attack on Cuba and would refrain others from actions of the sort. If you would recall your fleet, this would immediately change everything.
It seemed to us that that letter gave us the beginning of an opening to a diplomatic solution.
We and you ought not now to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, because the moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it. And then it will be necessary to cut that knot. Consequently, if there is no intention to tighten that knot, then let us not only relax the forces pulling at the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot.
As the letter developed, we had an enormous sigh of relief.
The single worst day of the crisis was Saturday, the 27th of October.
The morning of the 27th, we report that all 24 medium-range ballistic missile sites are operational.
Mac Bundy had an office in the basement, and as I walked by his office, a guy came out and said, "You're wanted urgently on the phone." He said, "A U-2 on a routine air sampling mission picked the wrong star coming back, and it was over the Soviet Union. He's fallen over the Soviet Union in a U-2. Everybody thought, oh my God, the Soviets are going to think we've started the war.
Now, I knew I was in trouble then, but I thought I should be raising duck butt. Now, duck butt is a rescue aircraft. I picked them up, and they asked me if I recognized a constellation, anything. And I said, yeah, I can see the belt of Orion about 15 degrees off my left off my nose. And then he made a few computations, and he thought, uh-oh, that boy's in trouble. Pretty soon, I get this call on the radio. Very good English. They wanted me to turn right 35 degrees. Yeah, some Ruski. About that time, Duck Butt called me again and said, turn left 15 degrees. And then he faded out altogether. But this Russian was still getting me to turn right. You know. And then about that time, I picked up a radio station right off my nose. Sounded like what I would call Russian music, you know. And I thought, oh, shit, I know where I am now. I had about 12 minutes of fuel left. That is about the time that those MiGs were nipping up after my butt. I had no idea where I was. I started yelling, Mayday, Mayday. And there were F-102s on either wing. They were going out after those MiGs, but they never met. I didn't know it at the time, but they had nuclear-tipped missiles. And I thought, holy mackerel, so I turned the radio on. They said, welcome home, we've been following you for 15 minutes, you know.
Kennedy was the first one to snap to, you know. He said, there's always some son of a bitch who doesn't get the word.
We received a letter from Khrushchev, which, unlike the letter we had received the night before, suddenly changed the terms, suddenly raised the ante, and said now that the United States must take its missiles out of Turkey in exchange for the Soviet Union taking its missiles out of Cuba.
The United States, on its part, considering the uneasiness and anxiety of the Soviet states, will remove its similar means from Turkey.
We debated in a somewhat meandering, sometimes rambunctious debate, how to respond to the two Khrushchev letters.
It was then that Bob Kennedy had a brilliant inspiration. He said, let's answer the first letter and pay no attention to the second.
Ultimately, the president decided that we should largely ignore the second letter, and he asked me and Attorney General Kennedy to draft that letter. Obviously, it's the most important letter I've ever written in my life.
Fidel came to the embassy showing great concern and realizing the Americans were planning an attack against Cuba in some way. Came and he said, I feel the situation is very tense, and within 24 to 72 hours there might be a very serious military action from the American side. So let's write a letter to Khrushchev.
There are two possible options. The first and most probable is an air attack against certain targets with a limited purpose of destroying them. The second, less probable, although possible, is the invasion.
What struck Khrushchev, particularly in that message, was the idea that an invasion could take place within the next 24 hours, that it was imminent.
The next most dramatic event was when the word came
that Major Anderson had been shot down.
Rudy Anderson was a mobile control officer there that day, and he was also the senior ranking officer, and so there wasn't any question as to who was going to be on standby, because, you know, we all wanted the mission. And you let the mobile control officer fly if there's only one, and launched him.
The plane was flying over Cuba and had almost crossed completely. We thought it was carrying the latest information and that once this was reported, strikes at Cuba would be inevitable.
I guess it wasn't, but probably 15 minutes later, he was shot down.
The commander made the decision himself to shoot the plane down.
The division commander said, "Are you serious?" I said, "You see the target?" He said, "Yes, I see it." And I said, "Are you tracking it?" And he said, "Yes, I am tracking it." And I said to him, "Well, hit it then." And within 30 seconds, it was announced that the target was destroyed. And that was it.
The look on Kennedy's face, he had to be standing up at the time the message was brought in, and he was visibly in shock. Obviously, it hit him right amidships. He was very shaken.
Khrushchev was very nervous because the shooting took place without any permission from Moscow on the orders of one of the generals in the field, I think. Therefore, the thought came up that if this could happen sort of spontaneously by itself, then something more serious could happen spontaneously.
That was the only time in my life I ever felt we were really very close to nuclear war.
The Soviets, in spite of observing the quarantine line, were going to fight back. We were going to have a war. We were going to have a military confrontation.
And there were those in our group who said, we have to immediately strike back with a bombing attack against the Soviet surface-to-air missile, or else they'll shoot down all of our U-2 planes. And the president said, yes, but let's wait.
The night of the 27th, Bobby says to me, "You didn't hear me say this, but I'm going over to the Russian embassy."
Robert Kennedy told the ambassador that the president agreed to give a commitment about non-invasion in Cuba in response to the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. Second, Robert Kennedy was prepared on behalf of the president to make an arrangement about American missiles in Turkey.
And then he said, President, well, President really would like to have an answer as soon as possible because timing is running and he is under very strong pressure from military who are impatient to do something.
On Saturday evening, maybe about 6 or 6:30 in the evening, a perfectly beautiful fall evening, October 27, 1962, as I was leaving the president's office to go back to my office at the Pentagon, I thought I might never live to see another Saturday night. Now, I know that sounds melodramatic, and I don't put it forward to stress the drama of the situation, but simply to indicate the uncertainty, the tenseness.
We went to the movies. He wanted to relax. And it's Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck in Roman Holiday. So by the time the movie was over, it's after 12, and we're just in these easy chairs, and I think the president had gone to sleep. And I said, "Mr. President, it's all over." And he said, "No, it isn't. Not yet."
After the U-2 was shot down, President Kennedy was under increasing pressure to order the airstrikes and the invasion. Military planners still doubted the missiles were ready, and they were still unaware of the tactical nuclear weapons in the hands of local Soviet commanders in Cuba. Meanwhile, the Soviets knew that Robert Kennedy, during his meeting with Ambassador Dobrynin, had implied a deadline. They just didn't know what that deadline was.
The meeting was scheduled to be held at a state dacha outside of Moscow. A general came in and said that he was just given a message over the telephone that Kennedy would be addressing the nation at 5 o'clock.
And nobody knows 5 o'clock on the Moscow time or Washington time.
At that moment, everyone thought that he was going to speak about an invasion or an airstrike or something drastic.
And so my father wanted to prevent this announcement and not to rise this situation.
So a message from Khrushchev in reply to Kennedy's message, which we received that very morning, was drawn up in great haste, I would say. It was given to Leonid Ilyich, who was secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party at that time, with instructions to drive at full speed to the broadcasting station and try to have it broadcast before 5 p.m.
I remember very well coming and getting this text. The text is usually brought by a sort of a messenger. This messenger service is run by the KGB, no denying it.
The haste was in order to forestall Kennedy announcing an invasion.
And when the time came, I went into the studio and read it and felt overjoyed. Here is the text, or the letter rather, that Mr. Khrushchev sent to President Kennedy on October 28, 1962. Esteemed Mr. President, the Soviet government,
in addition to instructions earlier transmitted to stop construction work on installations in Cuba, the Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
And I'm finishing breakfast, I hear the great news that Khrushchev agreed to take the missiles out. Well, the president had already heard it, and we were scheduled to go to the 10 o'clock mass. And I'm standing by the White House car, and as he stepped into the automobile, he said, "Dave, today we have an extra reason to pray."
The most unpleasant thing for us was this inspection at sea, when we had to open and show. And so that the Americans could see them, the missiles were fixed on deck and then put under tarpaulins. And when American ships and helicopters approached, then we removed the tarpaulins and the Americans could see how many missiles there were. For us military, I think that this was the most humiliating act.
The haste in which all this was done had some unfortunate consequences. One being that although a message was drafted and sent that afternoon to Fidel Castro, still there was obviously no time to consult the Cubans.
How did you find out that the crisis was over?
Through the papers, actually, the radio and the press. That's how we found out that the crisis had concluded.
How mad were you?
Terribly mad, terribly irritated. We considered this as something unjustifiable, and that actually affected relations between Cuba and the Soviet Union for many years, for very long years. Naturally, we did not want the war. We wanted a solution, but an honorable solution.
Deseamos, pero una solución honorable.
So you were totally in the dark.
No sabíamos que la crisis iba camino.
We didn't know that the crisis was on its way through the almost unconditional concessions made by Khrushchev. They left everything the way it was. They left the blockade. They left the dirty war. They left Guantanamo Naval Base.
So, in a way, though, the crisis still lives for you.
Yes, it's still alive. Yes, we could say that in a certain way.
Does that make you sad?
It neither makes me joyful nor saddens me. It keeps me calm, serene. I cannot deny that I would have preferred better relations with the United States and with any other country of the world. But for us, this is not something that is desperately needed.
So you just accept it and move forward?
It does not depend on us. It depends on the United States.
Mr. President, as you look back at the Cuban Missile Crisis, was it a wise decision for you to accept the missiles?
I believe that it was an unavoidable duty. And when you feel that you have to do your duty, you cannot analyze things from the point of view of more advantages or less advantages.
So if you had to do it over again, you wouldn't accept the missiles?
With the information I have now? No, I would not have accepted the missiles. With the experience of the Soviets' hesitation, I would not have accepted the missiles.
How close did we come to nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis?
I think that according to the steps taken by each side, we were quite close, quite near to nuclear war. Because the situation that was created was almost a dead-end street.
It is the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. We didn't know the danger was as great as that at the time.
One step away.
One step away. And the step, by the way, was the potential action of the president to launch the attack. Had the president launched the invasion, what Gudkov was saying is, we, the Soviets, would have retaliated with tactical nuclear weapons. And had the Soviets used those tactical nuclear weapons that they had on the soil of Cuba, we would have lost tens of thousands of Americans. Could any U.S. president have failed to respond with nuclear weapons? Of course not.
How terrifying is it to you today to think back to this time, to know how easily you could have made the wrong decision and we could have gone the other way?
I think that's the lesson to draw from this. Human beings are fallible. We all make mistakes. We all make mistakes in our everyday life, and we just expect when we just go on. Hopefully, we'll learn from them, not make any in the future. Those of us who have had some responsibility for direction and management of conventional military operations know we make mistakes there. And there, it's tragic because it's the loss of life, thousands of lives, occasionally tens of thousands of lives. But it doesn't lead to destruction of nations. If one makes a mistake in connection with the use of nuclear warheads, nuclear weapons, nations are going to be destroyed, even civilization can be put at risk. That's the lesson. And I think the conclusion one comes to is that the indefinite combination of human fallibility and nuclear weapons carries with it the certainty of nuclear exchange. What should we do in the face of that? Insofar as achievable, and I underline that, insofar as achievable, we should move back to a non-nuclear world. We're not on that path today.
In the end, although millions were placed in peril, there was just one combat death during the Cuban Missile Crisis, U-2 pilot Major Rudolph Anderson. Among Major Anderson's legacies is a daughter born several months after his death.
While we'll always mourn his loss and everything, it was kind of his death that left peace for us. In his wake, there was peace, you know, and that was what was special about it. You know, he had made a sacrifice. His sacrifice had meant something.
The world owes a debt to Major Anderson and to two men who resisted the pressures of power, ego, and politics to peacefully resolve the worst nuclear crisis in our history. What happened 30 years ago this week is not just some distant, dusty, historical footnote. In 1962, only a few powers possessed nuclear weapons. Today, there are many more. And as long as the capability exists for such unimaginable destruction, the crisis of 1962 remains a possibility today. I'm Maria Shriver. Good night.